Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keys. So today we need to talk about change. And change is definitely everywhere in conversations. We constantly hear how everything is transforming quickly, how technology is completely revolutionizing the way we work, the way we live, how one crisis after another is changing the context for peoples, for businesses, for societies. But is this always true, or is change sometimes a bit overrated? We're going to reflect on this by first reviewing the big economic, societal, and demographic changes in play. But we will also consider the things that change less over time through the lens of how people go about living their daily lives. So we will kick off with Simon, who will set the scene for us by giving us a view of what the public opinion around the world is thinking and how things may be changing or not. Then Billy will introduce us to the Ipsos Theory of Change, and she will also tell us how we've been using this framework to help us think about the future in a productive way. Manisha, in Changing Consumers, Changing Context, will discuss the need for brands to stay in tune with both the emerging and the constants in the needs of consumers, and how important context is if we really want to understand people. And at last, Mo, who is sitting in Amman, will take us on a tour of the megatrends shaping MENA's future, a very rapidly maturing region with lots of forces at work that he will tell us more about. And now over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for being with us today. And as Jennifer says, what I'm going to do is take a look at the public mood right now, think about some of the recent releases that have come out over the last few weeks, and go in search of both continuity and change. And if I'm looking for change, I don't need to go much further than our regular monthly What Worries the World study. I'm going to take us back to July 2021. Our question that we ask of people in nearly 30 countries around the world is, which three of the following topics do you find most worrying in your country? Now, a year ago, coronavirus was at the top of the list. It had been there for 15 months, and inflation was a second order topic for people, at least around the world, in 10th position. Today, inflation, bit by bit, month by month, has risen steadily to the top of the chart. It never really went up 5, up 10, up 15 in a particular month, just gradually, like a kettle boiling. But over time, here we're looking at January versus June, we could see it rising up the agenda in just about every country. COVID, meanwhile, is now in first place in 0 countries, having been as recently as February this year, still at number 1. So we're really seeing some change there. And I certainly could start to write conclusions or presentations around how this has been a year of dramatic change. Look at the rise of inflation. Look at the sharp fall in worries about the pandemic. And I'm not wrong there. You can see the trend lines. But I perhaps need to be a little bit more nuanced, and it's a reminder really that sometimes we need to look at a longer term lens. So here I've gone from 12 months to 8 years. I can see coronavirus very clearly. Of course, we hadn't thought about coronavirus or pandemics before, so it wasn't in our questionnaire, so we had to add it. We can see the rise of inflation over the last year from a fairly steady base where it had been quite dormant, but we can also see concerns around poverty, unemployment, crime and violence in all different countries around the world are always with us. They're always in the top 5. And it's a reminder that many of the big topics that we are concerned about day in, day out don't go away. And we need to be a bit careful about getting over-focused, important of course though it is to worry about the pandemic and cost of living crises on the changes that we see. And on that vein, a reminder really of how things can sometimes change quite slowly over time. I'm going to take us now onto the open road through a study that we do every year called the Responsible Driving Barometer in 11 countries in Europe. And we show people a series of adjectives about driving today. And we ask them to advise us on which adjectives most accurately describe you when you're driving, and which best describe other drivers when they're driving. Here are the results from 2017, so 5 years ago. When we think about our own driving, well, we're attentive and we're calm, and 97% of us give at least one positive adjective when we're thinking about how we take to the road. And these figures are almost identical this year. And it really feels this is kind of a constant thing that perhaps doesn't zigzag or move around very much over time. The other drivers, on the other hand, are of course the problem. And we think only 15% of them are attentive and only 11% are calm. These again being the 2017 figures, and 83% of them award other drivers at least one negative adjective. But here we're starting to see at least some signs of change, and it's very tentative, and it's just I think underlining how sometimes we have to be in spotting mode just to ask the question of what exactly is going on, because we're seeing a slight improvement. It's hardly dramatic, but more people now are saying that other drivers are attentive or calm. And a quick internet search by me finds, oh look, road safety in the EU, fatalities are down. Road safety levels appear to be a little bit better than they were a certain number of years ago. Now, I'm no transport researcher, I'm going to leave it there, but it's a reminder really that we do need to bring in other sources of information when we can, if we're trying to understand continuity and change. And to help us do that, another illustration from data many of us might be looking at if we're America watchers comes from the regular monitors of public opinion there, and in particular presidential satisfaction. Now, this chart is, I think, quite interesting in itself. It shows rising disapproval rates of Joe Biden in recent months, but the context, which we'll come on to later in the webinar, again, is important, including understanding what went before. Our team in America remind us that when the approval rating of an incumbent president goes below 40%, it takes their odds of being re-elected to less than 50-50. And so they're reminding us now that at 38%, this is perhaps an alarm bell for the Joe Biden administration. So this is just an example of how we can look back at what happened previously, and it can help us understand what's happening now. Second reflection, thinking about the public mood, is around the needs to be cautious with our conclusions. I just had to calm myself down about the year of dramatic change by looking at a longer time frame on those What Worries the World indexes. And here we're looking at our World Refugee Day survey. 78% agree that people should be able to take refuge in other countries, including their own, to escape war or persecution. The picture is of a refugee fleeing the Ukraine war. But in our headline or our conclusion, we need to be careful, and we couldn't go any further than this, saying we're seeing greater compassion for the forcibly displaced as the war in Ukraine wears on, because it's not clear yet about exactly where the cause and effects might be. We know, for example, that there are many other crises with people being displaced all around the world. So yes, agreement has increased since last year in most countries, but there may be many, many other factors in play. And indeed, if I take a longer term time frame and go back 3 years, agreement that people should be able to take refuge in other countries is higher than it was a few years ago. So again, we just need to be a little bit careful about instantly going for the cause and effect conclusions. And thinking again about being careful, I think it's a reminder for all of us on the call who are researchers about being precise, let's say, with the questions or with the design of our studies. We've certainly found, as we've tracked people's experiences through the pandemic, through our Essentials survey, that this question has been very helpful. We're asking people to self-assess themselves with their current situation around the pandemic. And it's one, I think it's really helped us. At the time, I think we knew we would be asking this over a series of months. We perhaps didn't know how many months we would be asking it for. But I think particularly when you're going to be asking something for a number of months or years even, really good to get that precision right at the start, because it's really helping to tell the story. This is the story of this year. It's showing us in these countries, Australia and the UK, people are starting to look a little bit towards a post-pandemic or new normal phase, at least in terms of the healthcare aspects of the crisis. And it's telling us different stories if we go to Brazil and Mexico, where there are actually more of a sense of returning to restrictions. So thinking about those dynamics of public opinion and taking us on the tour of these recent releases, certainly it reminded me of the need to bring in other sources of information or other lessons from the past. It reminded me to be careful about making too definitive conclusions. And again, it reminded me, looking at some of the data that we've collected over time, the more we can be precise with our questions or with our design, the more we should be in a good place to see what's changing and what's not. I've left the resources that I refer to in this presentation on our website, and you can explore those if you're interested in taking a look in more detail at those studies. But in the meantime, I'll hand back now to Jennifer in the studio in Milan.
Thank you very much, Simon. So definitely some things change faster, some slower. It seems that we're becoming slightly more empathetic, but I won't jump to conclusions. That was a little bit of optimism I saw there. Yeah. But we definitely still think we drive better than anyone else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone is worse than we are. Exactly. So I think this is this was a great intro to open the road for Billy, who's going to tell us more about the Ipsos theory of change and how we can analyze all of this that's going on. Billy, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to explain how we use the Ipsos theory of change to help us better prepare for a future world. As Simon mentioned, sometimes it feels like everything is changing everywhere all at once. We only have to look at some of the recent media headlines which sensationalize what's happening. You know, a huge change, uncertainty is everywhere. You know, the predictions for 2022, everything is about to change. And if you recall more recently, there was lots of newspaper headlines around the downfall of Netflix. But if we unpack that a little bit further, it's really important that we need to think very carefully when we think we see change before jumping to any conclusions. So if we unpack this Netflix point a little bit further and look at the share price over a 2-year period, you might say that lots of change is happening. But to take Mark Ritson, who's a brand consultant and marketing professor, he talks about the boring brown line of extrapolation. And actually, if we overlay this boring brown line, we can see that actually things aren't changing so much after all. So if this is the case, and we know that change is quite complicated and we need to take in other contextual information when we're thinking about change, how does it happen? Well, the first thing to say is that we don't all have a crystal ball. I think if we did, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. We'd probably be spending our millions that we've won on the lottery on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean. So when we think about the future, it's not about predicting what's going to happen. It's not even about being right about what's going to happen. It's about being prepared for multiple potential futures. And the cone of certainty, which is in the Futurist's toolkit, helps us understand this in a bit more detail. So if you can see where we are today, we've got pretty much a good grasp of what's happening right now, today in our rooms, in our markets. But the further we move out in time, the more uncertainty is at play and the more variable the future becomes. And this is because there are so many different interconnections that could happen moving towards the future as time moves on, that this could result in many, many different scenarios of the future. So when we're thinking about change, we have to think about all of the potential, possible and plausible outcomes that could happen. So at Ipsos, we use our theory of change to understand very comprehensively how and why change happens. So you can see here on our diagram, to the left of the diagram, we have our macro forces. These are the big contextual issues that are playing out across the world. They're the known knowns, if you like. They're happening, they have been building for some time, and they are likely, very likely to continue into the future. They're acting upon all of us as citizens, as consumers, as businesses, as governments. There's the context in which we live. So things like the climate emergency could be considered as a macro force. If we jump to the right-hand side of the diagram, this is where we look at what we call signals of change, so expressions of change. These are real-world, tangible examples of how change is happening today. So again, if we take the climate change example, we can see lots of examples of how businesses are responding to this. So latest example from Zara, who are actually forcing people to pay for their returns to try and get people to buy less in the first place. So examples of how businesses are tackling the climate change on the ground. And in the middle, we have our shifts in societies, markets, and people. If you like, this is the heartland that Simon has just taken us through. All of the opinion, attitude, value, behavior-based data that we collect about people and that we can track over time. And in terms of contextualizing this, it's really important for us to understand how that looks in conjunction with the macro forces and signals of change. So we use this model at Ipsos to really understand the interrelationships within the diagram, and these dynamics help us develop trends and also foresight. So to unpack this a little bit further, a trend that we've been discussing for some time is this idea of the missing middle, that fewer things attract a majority of people. And in this context, and if you think about it like a donut, the middle of the donut is it actually expanding. And in this context, it's really important for organizations that are seeking broad appeal to really find new areas of agreement to unite people or adapt what they're doing to suit different people. So if we bring this back to our theory of change, we can see that this particular trend of the missing middle is being driven by the macro forces around inflation, the cost of living, potential stagflation coming down the track, and also demographic changes like the aging boomers that we're going to unpack in a second. From a shifts level, if we look at recent public opinion and attitudes and values, we see things like high levels of public economic pessimism and move towards maybe becoming a little bit more localized. And then on a signals level, we can see real world examples of protectionism and polarization playing out, and also this idea of premiumization of basics. So just to take that a little bit further, if we look at the macro force level and something like aging boomers, this is really interesting because in 2030, baby boomers are all going to reach the age of 65. So what does that mean for society when they're worth nearly 8 times as much as US millennials? They're the ones with the cash. They're living longer, they're healthier, they're probably going to start retiring. What are they going to do with their time and money? A really key question I think businesses and brands really need to think about. And with this in mind, how is that going to play out when older people are holding more wealth? And could this further divide the generations? From a shifts level, I mentioned already this move towards local. And if we look at our long-running Ipsos Global Trends survey, we now see that 80% of consumers globally have a preference for products from their own countries rather than abroad. And on average, we see that this has risen 10 percentage points since 2019. So could this type of mentality, this inward focus, really help us think about how it could fuel divisions between nations? And lastly, on a signals level, we can see in many, many different walks of life, drawbridges going up all around the world. So things like in the US, they're building a chip manufacturing facility in the US rather than in Taiwan. They're spending $7 billion more to build it, to keep it within their own country. And if we think about this side of the pond, the European Union has just welcomed the Digital Markets Act, so drawbridges going up around regulation with big tech. So as you can see, if we look at the 3 levels of change, they can take us to this idea such as the missing middle. And this is how we use our theory of change to think about what's going to happen in the future. So if we can't plan for changes that we can't predict, then what do we do in this space? How do we use foresight and trends work effectively? Well, the first thing to say is that change is really complex and we really shouldn't oversimplify it. We all need to get comfortable with uncertainty, and particularly the further we think into the future when that uncertainty becomes more and more uncertain. And rather than feeling powerless or even being reactive to what's happening or even proactive, we just start embracing this preemptive mindset and really thinking how we can become more resilient to what's coming down the track. And last but not least, we are all architects of our own future, right? So people are the things that are going to be what the future holds. So we can all work together to create the future that we want by capitalizing on the opportunities that are coming down the track, but also becoming more resilient to future threats so that we can build the world that we want to live in. That's all from me. Back to Jennifer in the studio.
Thank you very much, Billy. Very inspirational. And I love this idea that it's not about being certain, it's about being prepared, right? So we all have, in our own businesses, in our own work, we all have our duty to be prepared. And I was wondering, with all the work that you do, and I know you work with lots and lots of companies on these topics, is there any tip that you would give people on the call as they, you know, think within their own organizations and start working to prepare the future?
Yeah, so I think if we take that middle level of the theory of change, so the shift in markets, peoples and societies, in that space, we're tracking things like public opinion, attitudes and values. And actually, if we look at our tracking over time, we see a sort of hierarchy in terms of how quickly change happens in those periods. So if you like, opinions are at if we take a sea analogy, they're the waves on the top of the sea and they change quite quickly. And I think that came like out in Simon's slides earlier around how, you know, what worries the world data. The values actually don't change that often. And if you think about them as deep currents in the sea, they move much more slowly, whereas attitudes are in the middle and they're sort of just under the level. So if you think about the data set and the question that's asked and what type of thing that we're trying to get at, that model can help us think about what's really changing and what's underlying and holding true over time.
Great, thanks. Very, very useful tip. And thank you very much for sharing all that with us. And we are now going to move over to Monisha, who is going to remind us again, but bringing it towards the brands, the importance of context. And context is where we see change. So Monisha, very keen to hear what you've been looking at and studying across so many cases.
Thanks, Jennifer. Billy just shared with us the importance of being prepared, of managing change. This is particularly important to us in the context of brand marketing because change impacts the context in which consumers experience our brands. And context is critical because it clearly defines what we deem is important. I've been thinking about this, you know, the idea of the changing context, the dynamic nature of our context today, and wondering, are the traditional ways in which we've been thinking about brands, which is we talk about functional drivers and emotional attributes, are they still enough to think about driving brand growth and explaining brand trajectories? Or are we seeing that there is more to it? To go into a little bit of data here, and I promise this is the only data slide I will share, is what we see across different data sets is contextual drivers are increasingly influencing brand choice today. While traditional drivers of whether I am emotionally and functionally attached to a brand are still critical, what we see is the rising influence of societal behavioral drivers that we bucket into this idea context. And interestingly, this is not about one category or one market. This is something we see across the board, across categories and marketplace. So how do we simplify this idea of context that feels very nebulous? And we've just heard there's lots of things that change, there's lots of things that are enduring. And how do we bring it all together to truly understand how we think about context, and more importantly, how we manage against it? I love to start with just something that's a really close-in context, which is the personal context. This is about me in the moment and what surrounds the moment in which I'm experiencing the brand, whether it's consuming or shopping for it. The idea of personal context is actually not new. This is probably the most leveraged part of context, where whether you're talking about the beverage marketer who talks about the morning coffee occasion, or you talk about the credit card marketer who talks about different types of rewards based on your usage patterns or the benefits you're seeking, this idea of leveraging and talking about the personal context has been in play for a while. And this is probably out of the different ways in which we can think about context, the one that's the most enduring, potentially the most predictable. But wait, before we go into the next layer of context, I really wanted to share an example of a brand. Earlier in my career, I had a chance to work in the Indonesian market. And one of the things that I remember being extremely fascinated by is this brand, Teh Botol Sosro, which is an RTD tea brand, which really did a great job of leveraging the personal context by associating themselves with food and beverage occasions and really driving unrivaled salience just by being consistent and by being truly immersed in that consumer's personal context. If you go to the next layer of context, so we talk about personal context being occasions, needs, benefits, moving on to the next layer of context, this is something that I like to think about as slightly outside the moment, but still around the moment. And we like to think about that as the social context. And when we say that, think family, community, the household, all that surrounds us in our personal context and also influences how we think about different things. To bring this to life, I wanted to use a couple of examples. One is a recent one. This is the Lego Let's Build Together campaign. During the pandemic, Lego did a great job of really understanding how the current consumer's context was changing, how families needed a lot of support. And so they stepped up to the plate. They created this split user platform, which could engage both parents and kids, infused learning, play, and STEM-based techniques. What did they do as a result of it? They managed to support families at a time when kids needed to be involved and occupied. They also walked the talk by donating a whopping $50 million to supporting underprivileged kids. And all of this actually gave them really good returns on this investment by getting clutter-breaking content in a time when it was very challenging for marketers to drive engagement. Another example, and probably a much used one, but I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of talk about it, is Dove. Dove is probably an epitome of a brand, in my opinion, that's seen as leading the way and being continuously in tune with the consumer's changing context. If you think about their campaign around real beauty, it was all about body positivity for oneself. But as the world and the consumer moved on to body positivity for themselves, to the idea of empowering, influencing, and really spreading the idea, they created the campaign around Detox Your Feed, which really built on the message of amplification and driving influence. So two great examples of how brands have really immersed themselves in the social context, a little bit outside that personal consumption moment and personal usage moment, and created a meaningful connect with their consumer base. That's not all. The third layer of context and how we like to think about that is the societal context. This is beyond the moment. This is a lot of what Billy talked about, a lot of what Simon talked about. This is probably the hardest for brands to authentically activate against, but this is where we see a lot of the macro forces playing a big role, whether it's planetary health, whether it's social justice, whether it's sustainability, all of that plays in the societal context. And successful brands really are able to play at all of these three levels of context, and not only at the moment in time, but predicting and managing against the change in all of these. If you were to talk about societal context, I would, the one brand that comes to mind as a beacon is Nike. They're always in tune with what the broader context is, what the world wants. And a recent example of they're walking the talk on their zero waste promise is fashionable footwear created out of 100% factory waste. So in summary, if you think about context and simplifying context, and you think of the 3 layers of personal, social, and societal, I'd like to close with this example. It's a simple one. Burger King did something unthinkable during the pandemic. They shared their recipe of one of their top menu items, the Whopper. As they did that, consumers could, in the personal context, still enjoy their favorite burger and make it at home without having to leave the house and without having the opportunity to dine in. In the social context, it meant you could still spend a lot of time with your friends and family and share and relive those moments. And if you think of the broader societal context, it meant me as a consumer, I am doing my part and spreading and stopping the spread of the virus while I'm still managing to spread some much needed cheer. So a great example of connecting and activating across the 3 layers of context. That's all from me. Back to you, Jennifer, at the studio.
Thank you very much, Monisha. So definitely very clear examples on the relevance of context and how brands can play to that. And I know that you have more up your sleeve, though, because I know you're doing a lot of research on this topic around brands and how they're shaping their comms and their innovation today. Beyond context, can you give us a little sneak peek onto what's coming next? What's the other big thing that brands will have to be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of context is anchored around like 2 other dimensions. Think about empathy. You really cannot appreciate the change that we've been talking about, that we continue to need to talk about. Empathy is one component, and the other one is really being able to set up and meet the right expectations so that consumers can continue to and experience your brands in these changing contexts in a way that they expect for them to show up.
Great. So empathy and setting expectations. So we are keen to hear about that in the future as well. Thank you so much, Monisha, for sharing this with us. And now we're going to real life, because Mohammed is going to take us on a tour of his region and what's going on there. A lot of change, I believe. Mo, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. So today I'll be sharing with you some of the key trends that are shaping the future of our region, the Middle East and North Africa region. And one of the key messages on change here is that sometimes change is not so obvious and could happen under the radar, particularly when we think about longer term trends. But first, for those that are not familiar with our region, just a brief intro. This is a complex and large region. Typically, we divide it into 3 sub-regions. You have the oil-rich Arabian Gulf, which has the Arab world's largest economy, Saudi Arabia. You have the ancient cultural Levant, which has been struggling economically as a result of conflict. And you have the less urban but more populous North Africa region, which has the Arab world's most populous country, Egypt. But despite these differences, the trends I'll be sharing with you today actually apply across the board. So, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So the first thing you need to know about the region is that MENA is one of the fastest growing regions globally. By 2050, we will be a population of just over 720 million people. That will exceed the population of Europe by 2050. And that's double what we started the century at 338. What those figures don't show you, however, is that what we will look like at 720 million will be significantly different than what we will look like when we were at 338 million. And one of the big reasons behind that is that we are urbanizing at a very rapid pace. So 30 years ago, just over 1 in 2 people lived in urban areas. By 2050, that's going to be 3 in 4. So there's going to be 150 million more people living in urban areas than today. Also, as a result, our fertility rates are going to be almost halved, or have halved actually in the last 30 years. We still tend to think of ourselves as a region with large nuclear families. No longer true. By 2050, we will be very close to the replacement rate, actually, below which the population eventually starts to decline. And with declining fertility rates, I think one of the changes that are least noticed in our region is our changing age structures. So ask anyone in MENA what the percentage of youth is, and almost anyone will tell you the region, 70% of the region are youth. We still use that figure, 70%. That was true in 1990, not today. By 2050, we will be a majority non-youth region, in fact. And while everyone's fixated on youth in our region, the fastest growing age segment is actually senior citizens. Today, 1 in 18 people in MENA is over 65 years old, but by 2050, that figure will rise to 1 in 7. So we need to start thinking about MENA's perennial generations, and at least to start shifting some of our focus towards the older, wealthier generations, such as Generation X, which are to a large degree forgotten in our region. But what's interesting about urbanization is that it's not only impacting our demographics, our values and attitudes are also changing as a result of urban lifestyles. So more and more of us now see ourselves as global citizens. We're starting to associate more closely with wider issues. And many more people no longer really share those conservative and traditional views of their parents' generation. And this is particularly true for the younger generations, more of whom are actually growing up in urban areas. So it's important for brands to really understand these changes and to really rethink how they approach consumers and which consumers they approach. And it was interesting to see some of those examples that Manisha was giving us earlier, keep up with the change. Second trend is that gender equality is becoming a necessity in the MENA region. This is a slide I'm frankly never proud presenting, but it's important to understand where we stand today. So our region today has the widest gender gap globally. A big part of that gap is a result of us having the lowest female labor force participation levels anywhere in the world. So only 1 in 5 women in the Middle East and North Africa region actually participate in the labor force. And this is largely driven by the fact that our conservative attitudes remain very strong towards gender equality. A majority still don't believe in equal freedoms between men and women. And interestingly, as you can see there, including 1 in 2 women in the region. But what's changing is the realization that this comes at a massive economic cost. A lot of our governments are starting to realize that 600 billion almost annually is the cost of gender-based discrimination, that this is a really big figure, and they could really use that addition on top of our economy. So we're already starting to see some signals from some governments regarding changing legislation that's in favor of female empowerment. And today, women in our region are actually in a much better position to take advantage of this. Many people outside the region may not know this, but the women in our region are actually strong influencers and decision makers within the household. Also, many more women are educated today and therefore more prepared to enter the labor force. So 1 in 2 students in the Middle East and North Africa region is a female today, compared to 1 in 5 2 decades ago. But to me, the most interesting figure is the figure down at the bottom of the slide. So as you can see, the majority today believe that women need to play a bigger role that extends beyond the household, including generating their own income. So this is a figure that's almost doubled over the last decade, again, as a result of economic pressure. So we expect to see over the next decade a significant shift in the position of women, and their importance as a consumer segment will continue to rise. My final trend is on how the economy is shaping consumer choices. So this one is particularly interesting for those markets out there that maybe only recently started experiencing sustained periods of economic pressure. In our region, we were already used to this because we've just gone through a very turbulent decade. And one figure that hasn't changed over that decade is this: 2 in 3 people say that the economic situation is their biggest concern. But as a result of this figure remaining high and not changing for a long period of time, what is changing as a result is how consumers make choices. So people in our region are much more price aware than they were. Over half we now define as deal seekers, compared to maybe roughly a third a decade ago. Store brand purchases are steadily increasing, including categories such as food, where maybe 10 to 15 years ago that was unheard of. We're also seeing brand loyalty take a hit. Many more people are likely to switch brands and try new ones simply because it makes financial sense. So it's important to keep track of people's concerns as well, because as these shift, what happens is it tends to impact their behaviors and their attitudes. So just to wrap up, 3 key takeaways on the change from megatrends in the MENA region. So the first one is that change is not always obvious. Sometimes big changes come in small doses, but it's important to view change through the right lens. Second is that change is complex. Change in one area typically leads to change in another, as we've seen with the impact on urbanization on our demographic profile and our attitudes and values. And the third is that context is key. it's important to understand the context through which change manifests itself. Earlier, my colleagues were talking about how sometimes change is overrated. What we see in our region is a lot of change is happening and it's going unnoticed by a lot of people in the region, and it's definitely more underrated than overrated. And with that, I hand it back over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Mo. You did an amazing job in taking us on this super quick tour, but you gave us a lot of very interesting information. And definitely you gave us this idea that you're caught in like a huge wave of transformation, like that feels very, very, very dynamic. And so I was wondering, just to put a little bit of a personal touch here, what does this mean for you personally? I mean, you live in the region. What's your transformation been like?
Well, for starters, I'm not getting any younger, Jennifer, so I am part of that aging cohort that's being ignored. I am a Gen Xer, so on a serious note, I'll tell you that as I get older, less and less brands speak my language, even though there's more of us and we're much wealthier than the younger generation. So I think this is one of the things that we all feel, but really goes under the radar, and I think it's an important one to watch out for.
Great, and it's also a very important advice to brands and to everyone that is watching us from around the world. I think we have more than 80 countries connected today, so it's really great to have given the world a vision of your region as well. Great, so with that, I need to thank all our speakers for their great interventions. I want to thank everyone that has been with us. We are going to take a little summer break, and hopefully many of you on the call will also be able to take a few days break over the next few weeks. We will be back in September, and we will be talking about serious stuff, because it will be this time about inflation and what it means for us and for our businesses. So looking forward to that. And in the meantime, thank you everyone, and have a happy next few weeks, and see you in September. Bye-bye.